All right. Welcome everyone to, as I said, our final webinar for the YEG Biodiversity Challenge. My name is Jordan Bell and I am the Citizen Science Coordinator at the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, one of the many partners that have put together this year's Edmonton Biodiversity Challenge. So if you're not familiar, the Edmonton Biodiversity Challenge is a 4-day urban photo BioBlitz using citizen science apps like the ABMI's NatureLinks and the iNaturalist app that's taking place June 10th to the 13th, so next week. And a part of this event is obviously to allow us to monitor the species and the habitats within our city limits by asking the people of the Edmonton region to share their observations to these crowdsourced data sets. The other goal is to allow people the opportunity to actually learn more about the biodiversity that is within our cities. And I'm really excited for this webinar series because despite being in the midst of a pandemic, the opportunity to host a series like this in advance of the Biodiversity Challenge really allows us the opportunity to connect with species experts and knowledgeable folks within our community and learn a little bit more about the species that we might be able to find within our city, how to ID them, and even how to photograph them and submit higher quality observations to these citizen science apps. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce Brittany Miller, who is a member of the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute's Bryophyte taxonomy team. And she will be sharing some info about the Bryophyte species group. And I know all of you are here to listen to her speak. And so I'll be passing things off to her in a moment. I just wanted to cover a few kind of quick housekeeping items before we move on. So first and foremost, I just want to add the disclaimer that we are live this evening. So this isn't a recording, and with a live presentation, there does come some uncertainty as it relates to operating on the internet and using these different platforms. So if there are any hiccups or glitches or audio issues, we just ask that you keep that in mind and offer us your patience as we sort through them. I will ask that everybody does try their best to remain muted throughout Brittany's presentation, and this will just ensure that there's no extra noise that's taking place, and so Brittany can kind of focus on delivering our content. And if you do have any questions, we are keeping things fairly casual during these sessions, but if you do have questions that come up during Brittany's presentation, I just ask that you share them in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we create some time to go through those questions with Brittany. The final piece that I want to mention is that we are recording this session, and we will be recording the Q&A as well. So I just want everyone to be aware as it relates to using our cameras and audio and things like that, that everyone is aware that we are recording and that it is our intention to make this presentation available on our YouTube channel and on the biodiversity website. So without further ado, I think I will pass things over to Brittany now, and we'll get right into this evening's content.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. Let me share my screen here. Go. Awesome. Whoops, my apologies. Okay, awesome. So yes, thank you, Jordan. So like Jordan mentioned, my name is Brittany Miller, and I study moss with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. and I love moss. And I'm very excited today to share my love with you. So I'm going to take you on a little journey, a little virtual tour through our city, through your neighborhoods, and then through the River Valley. Teach you a little bit about what moss is, what kind of species you might expect to see when you're out there mossing around, and really just get you energized and excited to participate in the Biodiversity Challenge that is next weekend. So I began my journey studying moss, working at the U of A in the Lafarge lab, and I got to go to some really incredible places studying these mosses. So as you can see here, what this actually is an ice patch in the southwest of Yukon. So these ice patches were melting away, and as they were melting, all this beautiful moss was coming out, ancient moss actually, some of it around 4,000 years old, 8,000 years old. And it was also embedded in very ancient caribou poo. So there's a lot of dung. So it was a really fun project, digging through poo, looking for mosses. I then was also very lucky and fortunate to get to be a part of a project that took me up to Canada's North Pole, our most northern island, Ellesmere Island. So this is actually me here against this behemoth of an ice formation, the Binstead Glacier. And it's not common knowledge generally, but mosses are actually very diverse and very prominent in Canada's north. So in these polar deserts, they actually really thrive. So I was very fortunate to get to go up to these places and explore the mosses there. After those research projects, I then was lucky enough to be able to join the ABMI team, the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. So I've been here for about 3.5 years, and my main job is to identify moss. So it's quite an amazing job to have. So a little bit of a background for anyone who's maybe newer to ABMI or isn't as familiar with what they actually do. One of the main focuses of ABMI is to detect and monitor biodiversity across the province. So this can be anything from like caribous to birds, or the cool small stuff like lichens and of course mosses. So every year we train a bunch of amazing technicians, really keen outdoorsy people that will go outside and collect a bunch of specimens for us. And then they'll bring all these specimens back to us. And then myself and all my other team members, we spend our time identifying them and studying them. So for me, that's dissecting and naming a lot of these beautiful mosses. So this data, what these mosses are and where they're from, that's actually information that you can look up yourself. So all of our data is available on the ABMI website. Particularly of interest is the biodiversity browser. So if you go on here, you can search any species of interest. So say a moss you want to know more about, where it occurs in the province. You can search that. So what I have here, for example, is a very common moss, the big red stem or red-stemmed feather moss. And on the map of Alberta, you can see here, there's tons of dots all over it. It's the gray and red dots. And all those dots actually correspond to sites that ABMI surveys. And the red dots are where big red stem has been identified. And so what you can see from this already is that big red stem is very ubiquitous across the province. And then over time, as we track these sites more so and track these species, we can get information about the changes in species diversity or the changes in occurrences of species. So maybe in the future, we find big red stem at more sites. Maybe there was a site it was in that we no longer find it in. And then this gives us information about the health of our ecosystem. So it's really powerful data that ABMI generates. So study moss. Clearly I like moss. You're gonna like moss too, but what is a moss? We think of it as the green fuzzy stuff maybe that grows on rocks on the forest floor, but what is it exactly as a plant? So mosses are actually the first land plants to be a part of our planet here. They're very ancient. They are approximately 500 million years old, which is pretty incredible to have these ancient plants around us that we can still study. Moss is part of an informal term called bryophytes, which actually encompasses 2 other groups of plants. They're all very closely related. So the first, obviously the moss is what you think of more as these leafy things, more common for us to see around our city or in our province. They almost look like more like the mini plants, like more typical leafy things. We also have 2 other really weird groups, one being the liverworts. The example of the liverwort I have here is just like green blob. So very different than what we think of our mosses, not so typically leafy, But this is just one type of liverwort. We have different kinds that you will find, and I'll dig a little bit more into that later to prep you again for the challenge. And then we have a third group, another type of green blob. This is hornworts. Hornworts, one has been detected in Alberta, but it's not well recorded. And they're more diverse if you think of in the tropics. You're gonna get tons of hornworts there. So not so likely to see them. It's more for interest's sake. It's really crazy looking thing, green blob with like green spikes coming out of it, which actually are its sexual reproduction tubes there. But you never know, you might find it. Get out there searching, you'd be surprised what you can find. So what they all have in common though are mosses, hornworts, and liverworts, that they don't produce flowers, unlike our trees or flowering plants that we might have in our gardens. They don't form roots, and they are non-vascular. So what that means is they don't have differentiated cells that allow them to regulate their water uptake. So if you think of a tree that puts beautiful roots into the soil, and then it's able to absorb and take water up through its trunk to the top of the plant at its leaves, and it regulates its water in that way. Mosses, liverworts, and hornworts can't do that. So they don't have flowers, they don't have roots, they can't regulate their water. How do they survive? How are they 500 million years old and are still functioning? Well, they actually have a really amazing suite of adaptive techniques that allow them to survive in our environments. So the first of which is poikilohydry, which is a really fancy, crazy term that basically means they have a laissez-faire relationship with their environment and with their water. So on the side here, you can see a cross section of a moss leaf. So very, very simple. As you'll note, they are one cell thick. So most mosses, not all mosses, but they'll just have their leaves with this one cell width. You may have some extra cells or some differentiation in the middle, which could kind of be analogous to like the midrib of a vascular plant leaf, but it's not the same type of tissue and it doesn't have that level of vascularization or any at all. Compared to the typical monocot vascular plant leaf cross section at the bottom, see a stark difference. Has tons of cellular differentiation, lots of mechanisms and types of waxes and things that help it regulate its water. So with moss being one cell thick, it actually can passively take in water as its environment becomes wet and then lose that water when its environment becomes dry. So it has this passive relationship that's really interesting. So with that, it becomes very important that moss is also desiccation tolerant, which basically means it can dry out and it can just chill. It can survive for extended periods of time. Some moss is better than other without having any moisture. So it can be kind of cool if you're out hunting. Some mosses can have a very different look to them, whether they're dry or wet. So here I have a wiry moss, Aviatinella, at the top, dry. It definitely looks really wiry. It looks a little more dull. The leaves are all stuck against its stems. Versus I give it a little spritz with water and it, like a breath of fresh air, the moss sprung back to life, leaves spreading, big, vibrant, juicy color, almost looks like a totally different plant. So I have a video here of a common moss you might encounter that I'll talk a little bit more about lately, but this is star moss that I found near my house. And it's dry. It was a sunny, sunny day. It looks kind of blackened, looked a little thirsty. So I'm spritzing it with some water and you can see already the leaves are like, oh, what is this? Water, amazing. They're starting to kind of spread. You can see in the back there, the color's starting to pop a little bit. They're going from black to this beautiful reddy, greeny, yellow color. They're coming back to life, which is pretty amazing. Yes, so from completely whirled, blacken and leaves against the stem to now more spreading, which actually, once they're fully wet, that gives them their more characteristic name, star moss, because the leaves will spread back like a star. Oh, whoops. So third mechanism that mosses exhibit that allows them to survive is that they are totipotent. So essentially what that means is there's certain places on the plants that are stem cells. So for example, like this picture you see here, this moss plant, this is a little piece of the stem that broke off the plant. And this was a kind of an older dead piece of plant, or quote unquote dead. It had blackened, aged. And then what we found, which was really cool with this plant, or what a lot of mosses will exhibit, is that even with this like broken little piece of stem, because this plant was damaged, the cells are able to de-differentiate and form an entirely new plant. So from that little fragment, it can form a whole new little leafy moss, which is a really incredible thing that's unique to the bryophytes, the mosses, liverworts, and pungworts. The last thing they do that's pretty amazing is they create a diaspore bank, which is essentially like a genetic bank in the soil. So certain mosses will produce interesting structures, like clonal structures, such as this polea in this example here, that produces these little bulbs in its leaves, which can be called gemmae. And these little bulbs can then fall off, land in the soil, and then they can remain dormant in the soil until the conditions are right or for it to have its growth stimulated. So when the conditions are right, it'll germinate and create a whole new plant, a whole new clonal plant. But you can also get different kinds of structures here. They're not always just little bulbs. There's a lot of diversity of moss, a lot of diversity in the types of diaspores that can be created. They can also be little leaf fragments that, again, when they fall off because of the stem cell capability, can form a new plant when the conditions are right. So pretty amazing. So now we know a little bit about what moss actually is and why it's so fantastic and so well adapted. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual anatomy of a moss. So what you're expecting to see, or what kind of terms you can use to describe some of the mosses you'll find when you're out next weekend. So the big main thing about a moss, the first thing that you'll look for and the main thing you'll see is the leafy part of the plant. So this is the dominant life stage of a moss. And it's more technically termed a gametophyte if you're interested. But the leafy moss part is a great way to describe these. Under fertilization, you will get a stalk produced, and these are usually like a reddy orange, but the color can vary and the length can vary. And on top of that, you will get what I like to call spore ball, which is more technically called a capsule. But you may have guessed it then, the spore ball is where the spores are produced. And this is through sexual reproduction, produces spores, and then those spores will fall out of the spore ball, land in the soil. They can also become diaspores, or they can just germinate right away and form a whole new plant. And those two structures together are collectively called the sporophyte. So now back to the liverwort anatomy. So I mentioned that these liverworts, unlike the mosses being nice and leafy, are just like green blobs that you might see growing in the soil. So that is one type of liverwort, what we call the thalloid liverwort, because it forms the more technical term of a thallus, which is just like the body of the plant. But you also have this very teeny different type of liverwort called a leafy liverwort. And these are so small that they actually grow in the already very tiny moss. So they can be really easy to overlook, but they are incredibly beautiful. So if you're able to get a nice close-up view of these guys, they are similar to mosses, but you can notice some quite a few differences right away. So they usually grow kind of flattened along whatever they're growing on. So in this case, on some bark. And they won't have those more typical kind of leaves. They'll usually have a rounded leaf or kind of little notches at the top, looking like little ears or something. They're quite cute. So for a thalloid liverwort anatomy, let me walk you through what's happening with these guys and what you might see. So like I mentioned, the thallus, or the body of the plant, you can kind of think of as the leaves, but they're definitely a lot different than a moss. You will have a stalk that gets produced, and in this particular species, on top of that, you'll get an umbrella. And different thalloid liverworts will have different tops of the stalks. They won't always look like an umbrella, but they will have some kind of cool formation at the top. But these are actually all collectively the gametophyte versus the moss. The gametophyte was just the leaves. And the sporophyte is actually produced underneath these little umbrellas. So this white fuzzy thing you're seeing is actually where all the spores will come out. For our leafy liverworts, these are really beautifully diverse. You can get different colors, like the one I showed before that was like kind of that ghosty green. This one's this nice, beautiful bluey red. And again, they can be rounded, they can have little ears, they can do a lot of beautiful different things. But what they all have in common is a few basic things. So first of all, the leafy part, which again is that kind of flattened thing that will grow along its substrate. But under sexual reproduction or under fertilization, they will produce what I like to call noodles or noodle stalks. So this is kind of like the stalk of a moss, but they will always be white. And on top of that, you will always have a little spore ball that is black. So a little matchstick or a little noodle with a black ball at the top. And these black balls will actually eventually just burst open and the spores will come out of there. So those are collectively the sporophyte. So a fun way to look for these tiny, tiny little leafy liverworts that can be really hard to detect, especially if you're brand new into the world of mossing around. Look for these little noodles. So you find a nice patch of moss, and if you see these little white noodles sticking out of it, then you know you have a liverwort somewhere tucked in there. So we know about moss, we know about liverworts. Where do we find these things? Now you want to see them, you're so excited. Where do you go? Everywhere. They are everywhere in the city. So they can be in underrated places or just like overlooked places like sidewalk cracks, like this beautiful silvery bryum here. Even in like wet little shady areas next to the sides of your houses, maybe under trees, on the trees, around your neighborhood, maybe even in like gutters. Mosses can surprisingly grow in a lot of amazing places. Just these ones typically tend to be a lot smaller. So again, really easy to miss if you're not looking. So it can be really fun to try and search these little things out. That's just in our like more urban areas, but of course, if you get into the river valleys or ravines, you're going to find an amazing amount of diversity. Our river valleys are just chock full of bryophyte goodness. There's a lot of juicy, amazing plants growing down there. So now that I've introduced you to moss a little bit, and we're feeling a little bit ready, let me take you on a tour of our city and show you some of these places to find mosses. And also I'm going to introduce you to some common species that you might be able to find and how to take good pictures for submissions on NatureLinks for our challenge. So come on, join me. Let's take a little walk here. Going down your city block. Nice, beautiful day. Something over there. What do we got? A moss. Beautiful. Found some. Fantastic. Tiny little moss just growing on that tree. So now we found the moss. We want to get a good photo of it. You need a few useful tools with you that'll help you get a really good photo and a really good submission so we can tell you what that moss is if you want to know its name. So the first really good tool to have is a hand lens. This can just be good for getting a little close-up view for yourself to know if you are finding a different plant or not. Your camera or phone. I love using a little macro lens with that to get a little close-up view, and maybe a spray bottle to wet your plant. And now you're ready for moss photos. So how do you get a great photo? You got all the tools, you found the plant. What are some tips? So one of the biggest things that can happen is you get excited, you see a moss, and we just take like a bird's eye view photo from just standing up tall. And that's really exciting that you found the moss, but if the picture's too far away, it might just look like a green blob. You could be like, oh yeah, that's definitely moss, but I cannot tell what moss that is. And then I can't tell you what it is, and it's very heartbreaking. So if you get up close and personal with the moss and you get some of the details of the moss, we're more likely to be able to tell you what kind of plant you have. So really get down to almost like eye level with the moss. Shrink yourself down into the world of the tiny moss. If you zoom in or use a macro lens, that can be incredibly helpful. I like to use, again, my little clip-on macro lens with my phone, but if you have macro capabilities on your camera or any kind of zoom function, that'll be really helpful. Another tip I have is to take a lot of pictures. So I really love photographing mosses, and I tend to take maybe 10 to 20 pictures per moss and just hope that 1 or 2 are actually good. Because they're so small, sometimes the focus isn't always what you want. So taking a lot is going to really ensure you get that really juicy shot. And again, taking some at eye level, maybe some just slightly above instead of too far away. Some when it's dry, maybe spray it a little bit with your spritz bottle, and then some when it's wet, and get a whole suite of images of this plant. There's a lot of tiny little features that make different species. So for example, in this picture here, I have these beautiful capsules. So like the shapes, or spore balls rather, the shapes of these spore balls can mean different species, the length or color of the stalk, the shape of the leafy part. These can all be things that are identifiers for different species. So if you're getting down and close and personal with the moss, you're capturing these tiny features as best as you can with the macro lens. It's going to really help us be able to verify them. And of course, you're new to the mosses, or potentially very new, you're learning them, you're not sure which features are important. So just take tons, take as many as you can. And if you miss some, not a big deal. Just get some photos and have fun with it. It can be really rewarding to get a really beautiful, nice shot of something so tiny that is easy to just walk by and not notice. So now we're ready. Let's take some pictures. So I'm taking some pictures here. When it's dry, I'm going to spritz up population. You can see they're already getting nice and green. Spritz up a few different little clumps here. Ah, yes, you can see it greening, it's happy. Threw on the micro lens and let's get some more wet pictures. And there you are, beautiful plant. Sun's in my eyes. So this was the first picture of when the plant was dry. So you can see it's got nice rounded, dull leaves here. It's this tiny little clump of moss. And then when I wet it up, this is one of the populations that was kind of to the side of that I was wetting up. And when it had that nice spritz of water, its leaves spread out. It like opened its arms, took a nice big breath of fresh air. So this is one of those examples where it's really cool to get a dry and wet picture of the moss because they'll look a bit different. And as you're taking pictures along this tree, you might have noticed there's another guy here that looks exactly the same, but something's kind of different about it. Its leaves look a little different. Is that a different species? Well, you would be correct. Mosses are really small and they can grow very closely together, and tiny things can actually make them different. So these two are very closely related. The first one here has pointy leaf tips, and the bottom one has rounded leaf tips. And there's some other features that are important here, but mainly that is something we can use to differentiate them. Are eye-level tree mosses or bristly mosses here. You might also notice here poking through, instead of having a really long, nice stalk for their spore balls are actually right in the leaves. So that's something, a fun little advantage of taking these like zoomed in pictures. You got a nice, nice find there. So this is your first moss or mosses that you are likely to encounter in the city. So your eye-level mosses, which myself and my coworker Terry coined that term because it's a really nice indicator of where to look for them, but their real common name is bristly moss. They're very short, so less than 2 centimeters, and they have kind of opaque leaves. And again, they're mostly eye level on deciduous trees. So that's where you should look for them. And those are the 2 features that might help you identify them or know you found one of these bristly mosses. So let's keep looking. Let's go on a longer adventure. We're not done yet. It's a beautiful day. Looks like maybe we got some cool stuff going over by this fence. Some patches of, oh yeah, it's moss. Beautiful moss. Let's get in there, get a nice picture when it's dry. Spritz it up. It's loving that on this hot day. Looks like maybe we got a few different species in here. So let's get some pictures, get eye level, and see what we got. Whoops. So this is another one of our mosses that I introduced you to a moment before when I was talking about desiccation tolerance. So this guy knows how to dry out the star moss. It can be like blackened and leaves curled up around the stem, but then you give it that water, its leaves spread back and its colors really shine. So it gets its name star moss because when you add that water to it, its leaves will actually spread backwards and give it this kind of star shape. They also are very short, just like our bristly mosses, about 1.5 centimeters, so tiny little things. But the one key thing that you'll notice with this guy is it has a long white hair at the end of each leaf. So it's very distinctive for their species. The leaves are also kind of opaque. Again, it can look blackened when dry, but then has that beautiful vibrancy when it's wet. And where you're most likely to find this is on exposed soil. So like walkways, like alleyways, like I had found it just by that, it was a cemetery by my house, along a chain link fence there. What else is in this city? What do we got here on the pavement? Looks like a bunch of fuzz. That is actually another moss, another tiny guy. So this is the picture I had shown earlier, the same species, this tiny little silvery moss, Bryum argentium, that loves to grow in sidewalk cracks and disturbed soil. So it is a cutie, but a tiny one that I'm sure a lot of us have actually just walked over. Maybe today you did. So it's very small. It's our smallest one. It's usually less than a centimeter. It usually forms these little clusters that kind of look a little wormy because the leaves are pretty close to the stems. It has silvery white tops. So its leaves will look kind of green at the base, but the top of the leaves will look whitish. So it kind of gives this overall a greeny, silvery, whitey look to the population. And again, like I mentioned, it usually grows on exposed soil. So it's soil that has exposure to the sun or like sidewalk cracks or anything like that. Maybe even just like in your driveways, you might be able to find it. All right, now we're getting into the river valley. Let's see what kind of beautiful mosses we can find down here. And this is Emily Murphy Park Trail, one of my favorite places to go looking for mosses. So come on with me, let's see what we can get. Gotta look hard. Mosses aren't as obvious as all these beautiful vascular plants, but look what we found, a beautiful soily ledge of moss. Let's keep going. Look at this. What is that? A phthaloid liverwort. Very exciting. Got to get a snap. Maybe some more for good luck. Get some different angles. Really important. Fantastic. So this one was actually a very incredible find and something really special that was just in our river valley. So this is the narrow mushroom-headed liverwort. So again, a phthaloid liverwort. And this species is actually one of the taxa that ABMI has not captured in our province-wide surveys. So the slide I'd shown at the beginning of my talk said that we had around 400 species of mosses detected, but there's actually around, or bryophytes rather, mosses and liverworts, but there's actually around 700. So this is why you guys come in and become really important and can do some really cool things if you're going out and exploring in the city. This was actually just along that trail, as you saw, just growing in some soil. You're walking along, you see a cool patch of weird green stuff, take a picture, and you might have been contributing to data that gives us really interesting information about what occurs in Edmonton, something we may not have been aware of before. So that can be a really exciting thing. And there is a lot of really cool stuff down in our river valleys. So this is one, but there's tons out there. So you're more than likely to find some really, really interesting different things that maybe ABMI hasn't detected before. Well, let's keep going. That was a really exciting find, but there's lots more to look at. What do we got in here? We go in the trees a little bit. It's moss paradise, usually when you get a little bit off the trail. Something interesting here, something different, and another different green blob. So these are two mosses that, again, are not very common, things that are very interesting. Again, just walked a few more steps, found some more cool different guys. Let's keep going though. Let's see what else we can find. I see a very nice log over here. Come with me, you gotta check this out. Ah, yes, logs are hot spots for diversity. We got this tall moss here. This is actually a liverwort, leafy liverwort, this blackened thing. Oh, and then right over here, a beautiful leafy moss. What a treat, what a good log. It's full of good stuff. I've only highlighted 3 here, but actually I bet you there was about 10 different species on there. Logs are a good place to look if you're starting to learn your plants. Let's walk through some of these ones we just saw, because these are some cool ones that are pretty common. So the first one being our juniper haircap moss. So this is a photo of that population I grabbed with my camera. So these are really cool plants. They can be tall. So we're getting into some of the bigger mosses now. Still short, but can get up to 10 centimeters tall. And they can be confused with mini conifer trees because they have thickened leaves that are pretty opaque, but these are mosses. And how you know for sure is if you find it with the stalk and the spore ball. So if you're lucky enough to find it with the stalk and spore ball, you also may be lucky enough to find it wearing a nice little hairy hat. So its spore balls usually have that nice hat covering them, which is where it gets its common name, the juniper haircap moss. And where you're mostly likely to find these is on exposed soil in our forested areas, so our river valleys and ravines. Even on trail sides, you might be able to find it if you're walking along, and sometimes on logs like we had just found there. The second one there, that black and fuzzy thing that actually was a leafy liverwort, is called tree fringewort. So this is a different picture here. This is from Hawrelak, but it has this really fuzzy green appearance. And the picture on the top corner there is actually one of these leaves isolated. And it has this fuzzy appearance because all the leaves have these little hairs coming off of them. So it's a kind of cool looking little leafy liverwort. It loves to go creeping along wood is where it likes to grow the most. It's usually pretty stuck on there. It really loves to grow on wood. So that's where you're most likely to find it, on these rotting logs in forested areas like our river valleys and ravines. And another thing or tip for finding this guy, because it is a leafy liverwort, it will have those noodles. So if the noodles have been generated, it's not always with the noodles, but look for them, the white stalks with the little black ball on top. The third one we had on that log there is our woodsy moss. So this is a beautiful plant that you'll find throughout the river valley. I personally really like it. This is very shiny and pretty. It's around a medium-sized moss, so 1 to 3 centimeters is medium for a moss. It has these broad, shimmering, rounded to diamond-shaped leaves. And it's another one that's when it's dry, its leaves kind of crumple in on themselves. And then if you give it a spritz of water or go out right after it's rained, the leaves will be spreading and broad and pretty. There's a lot of these woodsy mosses in our province and in our cities. And some of the ways we actually tell them apart, just for interest's sake, is looking at the teeth on the edge of the leaves. So if you have really good macro capabilities or a really good zoom function, you can get a shot of the teeth on the edges. That would be really, really cool. Not necessary, just something fun to do. So in this guy in particular, the teeth will actually only be on the top half of the leaves, versus if you find teeth coming down the leaf, that actually might be some different species. So fun little note there. And where you'll find these is on wet soil and forested areas, like our river valleys, and then you'll sometimes find them on tree bases or logs. What do we got over here? You're lagging, come on over. I got something I'm already taking a picture of. Right here, look. That is liverwort. Really hard to tell. You're like, what are we looking at here? There's obviously a lot of moss. And then that little whitish thing is a leafy liverwort. So a zoomed in picture of that, you can see it kind of underneath the moss. So this is what I mean when they are tiny and they grow in the tiny mosses. They can be hard to find unless they're kind of isolated, growing on their own, creeping on wood. But that was a really fun find, seeing that little guy in there. And I challenge you to find some liverworts. See if you can. It might be really rewarding to find some of these little things. So let's keep on our journey. There's lots to look at. Another log here. Look at this shiny, beautiful plant growing all over this piece of wood. So this is another one of our very common plants, one that you're surely likely to encounter if you're looking. So this is your aspen stalking moss, and it almost is on every tree in our city, in our province, at the base of the tree. So how you distinguish it is by looking at its branches, and its branches actually will curve upwards, as you can see in this picture here. It'll go creeping along the trees, so usually forms like these kind of like coverings all over the base of the tree. And another really important thing to look for is the spore ball. So its spore ball is actually straight instead of, a lot of them are usually curved. It has this really nice straight spore ball. And again, base of almost every tree. You can definitely find this one and find it growing in a very happy way. It loves Alberta, it loves Edmonton, it loves being here. All right, we're not done yet. What is this? More green fuzz. Looks different though. Looks a little different than what we've seen so far. Little fuzzy, kind of growing along the soil. Let's get some pictures. Got the macro lens on, lots of different shots. Macro lens off. Focus, different angles. What did we find? This is actually your elegant beak moss, another very common plant you're likely to encounter. This was forming when I was going through Emily Murphy Park, just along some of the trails. The edges of the trail that were like soil edges were just covered in blankets of this guy. It was very, very cool. So it's usually branched or kind of creeping along the soil, and it'll look kind of fuzzy because the ends of its leaves are actually kind of rounded. So it gives us this kind of fuzzy, frizzy kind of appearance. And again, it'll grow on soil in your river valleys or ravines, and sometimes on the bases of trees. Still got more in ya? Look at this. Let's get out the hand lens, see if this is something different. This is where the hand lens can come in handy. Looks different. Let's grab a photo. Beautiful. These are gonna look really great on Nature Links. Can't wait to submit. Very good. You keep searching, you will be rewarded. There is so much diversity, so much cool stuff. Look what we just found here. Spore balls. Let's get closer. Tiny little moss, tiny little spore balls. Fantastic. Let's walk a little further though. And an even bigger patch of these spore balls of the same plant, or what looks like the same plant. So these beautiful guys, you're surely to encounter because they're just going nuts right now with making these little stalks and spore balls. They're very beautiful, but they're part of a I hope you get out there and find some of these because they're quite beautiful. So those are the mosses we found on our little journey, but I want to show you some other ones that you're likely to encounter, maybe just not on that little portion of the trail we found there. And these are some of your bigger mosses. So this guy, very cool moss, tree moss. It's a large one growing up to 10 centimeters. And it gets its common name because it branches mostly at the top of the stem and it won't have many branches at the base. So it looks like a little mini tree. And there is no mistaking this moss. If you see this in Alberta or in Edmonton, that does that. It usually has kind of reddy stems that can be really visible if it's wet, and it'll be found more in wet soil. So along streams, creeks, or ponds, maybe more in like the shady, wetter areas of our river valleys and ravines. We also have our glorious stair-step moss. So this is a favorite. Biggest moss so far here, 20 centimeters in height. How you'll recognize this guy is it's ridiculously branched, very, very, very branched. It's branches of branches. It looks like steps of nets, which is where it gets its common name, the stair-step moss. So this is found in soil in the forested areas again, and this is one of your mosses that actually can grow so prolifically that it can form beautiful carpets on forest floors. Another one of these guys is knight's plume. So this is another large one, 3 to 10 centimeters tall. And how you'll distinguish this one is it has these beautiful symmetrical branches. So each branch on each side of the stem is coming off at the same length and kind of in the same way. So overall, one whole plant will look like a little feather, which is where it gets its name, the knight's plume. So like a feather in a knight's hat. It also has these curled, shiny leaves that are really beautiful. And you'll find it more on the soil again in forested areas. So it actually might be growing with your stair-step moss. And it'll look just like little feathers coming out of the ground. It's a really fun, beautiful plant to find. The last one here, and my favorite, the ruffed gooseneck moss, or electrified cat's tail, two of the best common names in my opinion. It's another beast of a moss, 20 centimeters in height. It gets its common names because its leaves stick out from its stems and have this kind of wrinkled, pointed look to them. So you can really see how it gets the electrified cat's tail name. Where the gooseneck comes in, and that's my personal common name favorite here, is because the top of the stem can kind of be curved over sometimes. So it'll look like a goose head and then the gooseneck. So if you see a nice little population of them, they almost look like little leafy goose armies, which I think is kind of cute. They're also unevenly branched. So unlike our knight's plume, where it had the nice branches coming off in an equal manner, you get just crazy branches coming off all over the place. So it looks like it has all these weird arms, the goose. So I hope you can find this one because it is really cute and beautiful. And really you'll find this is on soil in wet to dry forested areas. So like our river valleys and ravines. One cool place I've found this is in Patricia Ravine. That's a really fabulous place for beautiful mosses, but also in Mackenzie Ravine. You can find it everywhere if you just look for those shady, wet areas. So why mosses? I mean, they're super cool, but tell me more, why? Why should I participate? Well, as I kind of alluded to, we have a limited inventory of mosses in Edmonton. We don't actually very well know or haven't well documented our diversity. So you would be contributing amazing data that would allow us to know more about what plants are actually occurring in our city, which is just cool to know. It's cool to know your neighbors, the plants around you, the biodiversity around you, what you share your community with. This can also be really important then if we're able to track things over time, we can learn more about species distribution. So if we have a really good idea of what occurs in Edmonton, has that changed over time? Are we finding new things all the time? Is there depletion? These are the kind of cool questions we ask once we generate these databases. This also then really helps ABMI. So if we're finding these plants that ABMI hasn't detected before, that gives ABMI a wealth of information in terms of determining the health of our ecosystem. So it actually is it's really cool and powerful what you can actually contribute to as citizen scientists and moss lovers. Why participate? Why challenge yourself? Because mosses can be difficult. They're hard to find. They're easy to overlook, and a lot of them are actually really hard to ID. But just finding them, take that challenge, get out there, hunt the mosses, implore that difficulty, like get in there and really have fun with that. It is fun. It can be rewarding. So you decided to challenge yourself and you found this really cool looking moss, you got an excellent photo. It's a good time. It's a good way to spend a Saturday, in my opinion. And the moss, of course, is just beautiful. So why mosses, why participate? It's beautiful, it's fun. It's an amazing experience to get on this really kind of microscopic almost level and appreciate these tiny little plants that a lot of people actually, like I mentioned a few times, they overlook. You don't really get to see this kind of beauty in the world. So getting down to that level and experiencing it can be a really rewarding thing to do. So I highly recommend it. So if you want to learn more, maybe this has kind of piqued your interest. You're like, oh, mosses are so cool. I can't wait to get more juicy information, because this just was the
It looks like we might have lost Brittany there. So maybe we'll just hang tight for a second and see if she'll sign back in. Maybe her connection was getting a little bit spotty. So please bear with us for 1 second and we'll get ourselves back online.
Okay, again, my apologies, but thanks for sitting tight. So you want to learn more about moss. It piqued your interest. This is just like the tip of the iceberg in terms of moss information, and just a few handful of species to introduce you to. There's tons more information out there. So if you find that you're someone who's just really excited, you want to learn a little more, I have some good resources for you. So first of all, joining the Alberta Native Plant Council. So this group works with all types of plants. And myself, I have my email here, bmiller3@ualberta.ca, or my coworker, Diana Terlia. You can email either of us to join the group. We co-run or organize the Edmonton Study Group chapter. And I'm planning on maybe doing some little mossy walks for the Biodiversity Challenge, kind of informally. So if anyone's interested, feel free to email us or just to join the group as a whole and hang out and get to know some like-minded individuals who also really love plants. There's a really nice free guide through Nate. So this is mostly mosses and liverworts of peatlands, but it can be really nice to just kind of flip through and get some exposure to some of the different plants you might expect in Alberta. So again, not really things you'll find in Edmonton, but just again, a really nice way to look through some gorgeous pictures of mosses. The British Biological Field Guide. So this is kind of coming out of left field, it's European, but again, it just has some really nice images, some really good descriptions, maybe just a nice way to kind of introduce you into some of the diversity. There's a surprising amount of overlap with plants. So again, just another fun way to get to know your mosses. More importantly, probably the best one here is the ABMI Biodiversity Browser. So like I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you can go on here onto our website and look up any plant you're interested in, any moss you're interested in that ABMI tracks, and get some data that ABMI has generated, information about those plants on there. You can also, of course, post it on Nature Links. That's an amazing way to get to know your diversity. So you find something cool, you're seeing it everywhere, you want to know what it is, take a beautiful shot of it, post it for us. Myself or one of our other experts will verify whatever it is, whatever you post, and I'll give you a little bit of information or tips on how to ID it, and then you can slowly build up your skill set that way. And of course on iNaturalist as well, which is a part of this challenge, post on both. Post all the time, it's a lot of fun. And send me questions. I have several avenues that you can contact me, all with the same tag or with that same email I just provided. I love talking about moss. When I say I love moss, that's an understatement. It's a consuming thing for me, and I'm very happy to discuss and talk moss with anyone who's interested. So feel free to bug me as much as possible. I would love to do mossy walks or just answer some questions. So with that, I implore you to take the biodiversity challenge. Get out there, look for mosses. They're understudied in our city and they need some love. They need you to take the challenge, get out there and look for them. And enjoy looking for it. It can be a really, like I mentioned, rewarding experience. It's really fun to get exposed to all these beautiful, different little plants. And thank you so much for listening to me talk today. And I hope you all have a lot of fun next weekend and find some really amazing things.
That's great, Brittany. Thank you so much for taking us on that fun tour of Edmonton and sort of showcasing where we might be able to encounter some of these mosses, both in our communities and within the river valley. So I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here, but yeah, thank you so much. So we do have a few questions for you that have sort of filtered into the chat. And so we'll sort of run through some of them.
Awesome.
So our first question sort of relates to the species of moss that we can find within the city of Edmonton. So last week, Diane, when talking about lichens, she had sort of talked about this Edmonton inventory and a growing species list. Does anything like that exist for mosses currently, or do we know how many species we have within the city?
Great question, and I wish I had a good answer for you. All I can say is we're kind of working on it. Nothing exists right now. I mean, we work on it together. Get the citizen scientists out there, all of you guys posting pictures. We'll find out what's out there. I know myself, I'm trying to do collections. But of course, you need permits to do such things. And these are the ways that we eventually, getting the permits, getting these collections, getting all this data from NatureLinks, we can generate these things for the future. So no.
But what you're saying is the time is nigh, and if we would like an opportunity to contribute, we could start by participating in an event like the Biodiversity Challenge.
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. So our next question here is relating to like peat moss, and you know, do we have an understanding of like what is the most common like species that we would consider to be peat moss? Like, could you tell us a bit more about that, or is it a group of species, or what is peat moss, I guess?
That's a really good question. So I will start with a little caveat that you will probably not find peat moss in Edmonton, but peat is a big part of mosses. It's kind of what people think of when they think of moss, is peat moss. So peat is actually by definition just an accumulation of carbon or organic matter. But there's a lot of mosses that contribute to that, specifically sphagnum. So sphagnum is a big peat forming mosses. So if you get like outside the city, even just to Wagner Natural Area, that is a peatland where you'll see a lot of these beautiful sphagnum covered lands, like the landscape there. And there are some like very dominant species that we've actually found like through ABMI, through all the tracking it does. So I don't know the common names, unfortunately. I'm not as good with the common names. I more function in the Latin. But Sphagnum fuscum would have to be the most common peat moss in Alberta. So this is a little brownish kind of sphagnum that forms really compact tufts that has brown stems.
That's great. Thank you very much. So we have another question here just about the use of the macro lens. So in your video, you had this great little clip-on attachment for your phone, and do you have any recommendations on where to find something like this, or any specific, you know, brands or something like that?
Yeah, I don't work for any of these companies, but I will. No kickbacks here, just my own recommendations from my personal usage. So I have an Android phone and I really love it. And I found a lens that just works properly with where the camera is on the Android. So the Blackeye brand is what I use, and I absolutely love it. It's about 20x magnification. Diane, we saw her talk last week. She has a different lens that she absolutely loves. The name of it evades me right now, but it works for her iPhone. Basically, there's tons of different brands out there. I spent a little bit of time researching them before I bought mine. Mine was only $40. Like, it's really affordable, and then it really opens up the world of Moss IDs for you. So yeah, just get online, search macro lens, and maybe find one that works best for you. If you're someone like me that just has their phone and not your obviously your fancy cameras with like the macro lenses as attachments.
That's great. Yeah, so knowing that there are different macro lenses based off the model of your phone, but I think it's quite clear after your talk and Diane's that having something that allows us to zoom in and get a really high quality image of the species is really important for ID. So maybe an essential tool for budding bryophyte interested people.
Excellent.
Yes. Okay. Any other questions? We certainly have a few extra minutes here. We do want to be conscious of the time, as we are just a little bit past 5. But otherwise, you know, if we are running out of questions, Brittany did provide all of her contact info And perhaps I will just ask if she can share some of that info with me following, and then I can circulate it to all of you so that you just have it on record. But we did record this session and we will make sure it's available on the website. So lastly, Brittany did a really great job of highlighting the importance of participating in the Biodiversity Challenge. So I did just want to send out that final request and to let everyone know that the challenge does take place next week. And it'll be 4 days from June 10th to the 13th, where you can use your smartphones or your regular cameras to take pictures of biodiversity and contribute them to this BioBlitz effort here within the city. I thank everyone for sticking around and participating in this webinar series. It was such a pleasure to bring in experts and knowledgeable folks like Brittany, Diane, Alex, and Chris to share their knowledge and sort of help us learn a little bit more about some of the species we can find here in our city. And I hope it provided a little bit of extra inspiration to get out and participate, if not in the Biodiversity Challenge, but just on your own free time and experience some of the species and the different habitats we have within our city limits. So thank you very much, Brittany, and thank you to everyone who participated. And we look forward to seeing you out there next weekend and seeing your sightings on NatureLinks or iNaturalist.